Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Drive Pink Dialogue. There's been some big news today as Inter Miami has finalized a deal with Atletico Madrid. There's agreement in place for Inter Miami to sign midfielder Rodrigo de Paul from Atletico Madrid. We're going to get into it. We're going to talk about the details of the deal as far as we know. We're going to talk about how this could possibly work by MLS standards. We can talk about how he fits in. What are the long term implications? What does this mean for Inter Miami's transfer window? We're going to get into all of it. But I want to start by saying, unbelievable deal that the Inter Miami ownership and Jorge Mas, I think in particular, deserve a lot of credit for getting across the line. This is a um, unbelievably talented player. And I think if you look at MLS history, who are the players that are in a similar category? You find very few. This is a guy who started week in and week out for one of the 10 best teams in the world. There's no doubt this is, I don't know if, depending on your definition of world class, he's either world class or he's in that very next tier. He's 31 years old. He's still in his prime. He's going to be on the Argentine national team that goes to the World Cup next summer and probably going to be a starter if everything goes as you would expect and I'm sure as he expects. So for Rodrigo de Paul, this is an incredibly interesting deal. For Inter Miami, this is a slam dunk. And so just to start off, this is a huge thank you as a fan and applause to the ambition of this ownership group for going out and trying to make this happen. We know they are ultra ambitious. Obviously, everything they've done in this Lionel Messi era shows that. Even if you go back to the founding and you talk about the type of transfer fees paid for guys of much lower status, right? Those early, not U22, but those early 19-year-old teenagers they were signing like uh, Pellegrini and Carranza, and you think about the transfer fee for, of course, his name's for Rodolfo Pizarro, and you think about the wages for guys like Higuain. The ambition's always been there, but obviously when you get Lionel Messi, the ambition takes a step forward, and then what's possible takes a huge step forward. And it's not always easy to capture that. And I think Inter Miami has absolutely done that with this move. And so I want to give the ownership group, the front office, Lionel Messi and his team, whoever was involved in making this happen, I just want to give them a tremendous amount of credit because this is a huge signing. This is a huge deal. When you think about the league's history, and maybe we will do this when we have more time to think about how this fits into the history of the league, we will spend a lot of time talking about the importance of this deal. Not as number one, obviously, Lionel Messi, David Beckham were bigger, but in that next tier, I think this might be as good as anything. So I just want to start off by giving them a huge, huge amount of credit, not just for the ambition, but the wherewithal to go make it happen. Going to Madrid, finalizing with the player, getting this player now, not waiting until next summer, not waiting until he turns 35, not waiting until it becomes a free transfer, et cetera, et cetera. Just going and getting the deal done to make it happen. I am going to get to the chat. I'll start now because I want to get to everyone. But again, lots of things to get into. Gabriella says, I'm just very excited to see how he fits in and how we play once he starts. We are lucky as fans. I agree, and we will definitely talk about that. Vaishnav says, 4-year deal means no loans, correct? Direct transfer. As far as we can tell, that's exactly what's happening. Sviterik says, I can't believe this is really happening. Cringe says, wow, let's go IMCF. Elmer, wow. This is a huge deal. And I want to make sure we start there. What is the deal? Inter Miami has this deal done according to, I think it was first reported this morning by Gaston Idul, who is a very good Argentine reporter, confirmed a little bit later by Fabrizio Romano, Franco Panizzo, and others. So this is a real deal. It's a done deal in terms of the agreement. Maybe they're finalizing, what the bonus structure looks like or whatever. But this is a deal. This is a done deal, not just with Atletico Madrid, but also with Rodrigo de Paul. He will be signing a 4-year contract. We'll get into what that means in a minute. And then Cesar Luis Merlo reported a couple hours later that this was going to be a 15 million euro deal with a few bonuses involved. And I think that number is really important as we get into the rest of this conversation. So Inter Miami going to pay 15 million euros, whatever the exchange rate is, $17 million, something like that, for this player. There'll be some bonuses attached. Uh, Obviously, this is a huge signing. It's going to be the club record fee. I mentioned Pizarro's 12 million signing back in 2020. That was the record at the time. Now we have a new record. Inter Miami has a ton of money from everything they've done since Lionel Messi got here. They've done a great job of marketing the team, selling jerseys, filling out the stadium, filling out opposition stadiums, the preseason tour from last season. All of these things they've done to generate wealth. Well, some of it's going back into the team, and I think that's hugely, hugely good. It's a positive sign to see from the ownership. The MLS roster rules have constricted what Inter Miami can do, but as far as maximizing what they can do from that perspective, I think they've done an incredible job. And this, I think, is another aspect of that. And maybe they've even pushed the limits a little bit here. As far as Atletico Madrid, this is a 31-year-old midfielder, still good. I think by a lot of Atletico Madrid fans, this was his best season this past year in terms of consistency. So not an easy player to replace, but they have gone out and signed a couple midfielders, especially ones that Inter Miami fans might know well. Johnny Cardoso is probably the direct replacement. USMNT player coming from Real Betis, was recently in Brazil. He's a guy that probably is the direct replacement. He's a little bit more of a defensive midfielder, less of a box to box, but in terms of one for one in and out, they did just spend 30 million to confirm the deal for Johnny Cardoso. And they're also bringing in Thiago Almada for 40 million. I know he's more of a forward player, but I think in La Liga he can play some midfield. And for Atletico Madrid, I think that's another option in there. Spending 70 million on those two players, Thiago Almada, former Atlanta United player, I think allows them to let some midfielders go. Now, I know they have a couple other midfielders leaving, but Rodrigo de Paul is also one of them. Probably would have been someone other teams in Europe wanted. He had 1 year left on his contract. If he was willing to renew, I think Atletico would have been happy to keep him. But it came out that he wasn't interested in renewing that contract, partially probably because of this. He wanted this move to Inter Miami. And so when that became the case, Rodrigo de Paul became expendable for Atletico Madrid, and then they went out and spent 70 million on a couple new midfielders. Rodrigo de Paul, he's going to sign a 4-year contract, according to everyone today. That will start immediately. I was thinking about this when this news was broken, and I thought that doesn't really make sense because you wouldn't have a contract run out in the middle of this season, right? You fast forward to 2029 when this would expire. If it expires, July 1st or August 1st or whatever of 2029, that wouldn't make sense. But I wanted to give credit to Adesin Kanmi, Twitter user, who reminded me that it's probably very likely that the MLS calendar will be reshaped by that point in time and will take on the shape of the European calendar. So it actually makes a ton of sense that he would sign and have that contract end in the summer of 2029. And so when you think about it that way, it likely means there's no loan deal for Rodrigo de Paul for the next 6 months. He's coming now. The transfer fee numbers, as Cesar Luis Merlo reported, 15 million. That's a done deal. And so this feels like a straight up transfer, and that will be important as we get into how Inter Miami did this. The last thing I wanted to mention, the transfer window for the MLS opens on July 24th. That's the first day you can register new players for the summer window. Inter Miami does have a game against FC Cincinnati on July 26th, but it's much more likely that he's going to debut for the following game on July 30th against Atlas. That's the first game of the League's Cup. So if you're wondering when you're going to see him, I would say pencil in that July 30th game against Atlas as the most likely first appearance for him. Not only do they have to go through the work permit process and all of that, but you also have to make sure that you have a big moment, I think, for the debut of this big player. this first game of the League's Cup is when Lionel Messi debuted, and so it's a prime moment to get people excited about the league, to get people excited about Inter Miami, and doing it for a big tournament for Apple TV, I think is a huge, huge deal. Okay. Rossell says, do you think Miami will sign someone other than DePaul this window? We will talk about that at the end of this conversation. What comes next? What other positions might they target? RJ says possible debut in the Leagues Cup. I expect him to debut for that opening game of the Leagues Cup. Paolo says it would be nice if they could get a better head coach. Certainly agree with that. RJ says we can only announce the signing after July 24th, right? We can announce it whenever. It's just he will not be eligible to play. So they can, if they sign him today, they can announce it. Generally, Inter Miami does not announce it until that player is eligible. So I wouldn't expect it to happen until you get the medical done, the contract signed, and then we'll see him holding up that contract with whoever the sporting director is, or maybe his jersey at the training facility. I wouldn't expect that to happen until maybe Monday or Tuesday, but basically that July 24th date is when you can register them to actually play for the MLS, and so I think Inter Miami will wait until then. Okay, so how is this possible? Because Inter Miami has 3 designated players. And in the MLS, you're allowed to have 3 designated players. Inter Miami already has 3 designated players. Lionel Messi obviously is a designated player. He's making $21 million plus whatever side endorsement deals they have with Apple and Adidas and whoever else. Sergio Busquets is making $8.5-ish million this year as part of the contract he signed when he first arrived in Inter Miami. He's also going to be a DP. There's no way to buy him down. And as we found out a couple weeks ago, Jordi Alba is making $6 million this year. That means there is no way for Inter Miami to buy him down, according to the MLS Players Association. He signed a contract that paid him a TAM level wage for the first year and a half of his time at Inter Miami. And that deal had an option for a $6 million salary in 2025. Inter Miami was not able to renegotiate a new contract with Jordi Alba before the season, which means that his 2025 salary is the option that Inter Miami triggered last December, and that is $6 million. There is no way to buy that down according to current understood MLS roster rules. He did sign a new contract maybe 6 weeks ago for the next 2 seasons beyond this year. As far as we can tell, there's a very high likelihood that that's a non-DP contract. So for 2026, 2027, it's more likely than not that Jordi Alba will not be a DP. But for 2025, he is a DP, assuming the MLSPA has been accurate in their information. Which makes it tough because Rodrigo de Paul would also be coming in as a designated player. He's going to be a $15 million transfer fee to Atletico Madrid. So there is no way for Inter Miami to manipulate the contract, manipulate when we pay him different amounts, when we pay Atletico Madrid. There is no way under the currently understood roster mechanisms to make this player a DP and to register him now. So how is Inter Miami going to do it? I think that's the biggest question and most interesting question for this whole transfer saga. Obviously, once we found out that Inter Miami was going for this player and the player was interested in coming now, that was the biggest deal. But how do they actually get him into this lineup, into this roster, given the fact they have 3 DPs and his transfer fee will make him a DP as well? I don't have the answer for you. I have a couple potential suggestions. We can talk about them, but I don't know what the answer is, and maybe we will find out over the next few days and weeks what exactly the answer is. Maybe it'll be on Twitter by the time we finish recording this episode. Here are the 3 ideas that make sense to me. The first, and the reason why I mention this is because when the Rodrigo de Paul deal came out publicly, Tom Bogart, who is an MLS transfer sort of person, expert around the MLS, said that the only way to make this happen was for one of the Inter Miami DPs to retire. Now, obviously, Lionel Messi is not going to retire mid-season. He has big plans for the future of this club, and obviously wants to go to the World Cup and all that stuff. Jordi Alba just signed a contract extension, so him retiring doesn't really make sense. And then the last one would be Sergio Busquets, who does not have a contract moving forward. Uh, this is the early speculation. I should also add Luis Suarez is not a DP. So anyone who's suggesting that Luis Suarez should be the one to retire, that doesn't really solve or change anything. So you can scratch that off the list. So Busquets retiring. We speculated on this when this rumor first came out. And as you guys might remember, we talked about it like this was the most logical solution. And it's incredibly tough to think about because Sergio Busquets is a unicorn for this game. And I know people might say he might turn the ball over a little bit more and he's not as athletic as he used to be. He's still a unicorn in what he does. And I think we've seen plenty of really good performances from him lately. So it would have been a bitter pill to swallow. But if that's something Busquets wanted, it's not up to us as fans, right? Then you started thinking about it. You didn't really hear anything about Busquets thinking about retiring. And so you started to think about what else this could be. And I kind of came up with this plan in my head that made sense where Inter Miami could loan Rodrigo de Paul for the rest of the 2025 calendar year and pay him a salary that would make him a max TAM player, work with Atletico Madrid so that they would buy down whatever salary he needed to be bought down for the rest of the 2025 calendar year. And then you pay a mandatory future fee in January that would trigger, it would cover Atletico Madrid's expenses in terms of how much they covered the salary, whatever transfer fee they wanted, etc. So you'd work with Atletico Madrid to manipulate the rules so you could bring him in on loan and then sign him permanently in January. That doesn't feel likely now based on the reporting we've gotten today, especially the fact that he's going to sign a 4-year contract. The fee is 15 million euros plus. And so it seems like, and again, I'm hyper fixating on the words of Gaston Edul and Fabrizio Romano and sort of how they phrase things. We might find out this is how they're doing it, but based on the wording and sort of reporting we've seen today, it feels like it's going to be a straight transfer for this summer, which leads me to the only other explanation that makes sense. And by the way, if it's a straight transfer this summer, then of course he becomes a DP because of the transfer fee, because of the salary. And that presents all these problems with having 4 DPs. So the only other thing that makes sense is that there's a new MLS roster rule that is about to be unveiled starting on the 24th. There is some rumors that MLS commissioner, and his name is escaping me at the moment, I apologize, that he has some announcement this week. I don't know if that's for the All-Star game for next year or, it could be something nonchalant, not very interesting, but it also could be something major. We've heard some comments from the MLSPA over the last 48 hours. I don't know if that's related to some sort of new initiative the MLS is doing and they want to make sure they keep their leverage. So maybe it's possible that there's a new MLS rule coming into play over the next week and a half. And that's what Inter Miami is going to use to sign this player. Maybe they know something we don't know. Maybe they have some crazy workaround that's never been tried before. Maybe maybe some player wants to do something else with their career. So I think those are the 3 possibilities. Either Busquets retires or is bought out and paid. You have a loan and sign for January. So you loan him in now and then you sign him permanently in January. When Sergio Busquets' DP contract runs out, when Jordi Alba with his new contract is likely no longer a DP, and then Rodrigo de Paul can fit in alongside Messi as your second DP. Or there's some sort of new MLS roster rule that we're not privy to. And if that's the case, it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of it over the next couple days and weeks to see, because if there is a new roster rule, it would affect not just Inter Miami, obviously, but it would affect the whole league. And people have continuously wanted to see them make pushes to be as good as they can for the club, for the World Cup coming up next summer and all that stuff. And I think that would be interesting in its own merit. The Devonit says, ambitious move. Love this club. Enjoy the ride. I think that's the best way to think about this entire transfer. Naya says, what's happening? They're signing Rodrigo de Paul. Lightning says it's actually happening. Um, Nick Powell says the MLS website shows only 2 DPs. I do want to clarify this because this is something that people bring up a lot. The MLS website is historically very inaccurate. And if you go look at it, you will find 7, 8 errors on the Inter Miami page. So I know people have clinged to that and said Jordi Alba is not a DP because it's not listed as a DP on that website. But there's a lot of players that are missing their international designation, their U22 designation, etc. So that is not a reliable website. What you really need to look at is the MLSPA's salary reporting information, which came out a couple weeks ago. And then the MLS has, as of last season, produced a roster construction detailing exactly what every player is. That one came out in March, so Inter Miami obviously could have made moves or changes since then, but the MLSPA salary information that came out a week, maybe 2.5 weeks ago, lists Jordi Alba as DP. So, I think that is the historically much more accurate information. Francisco says Garber will change the Garber, thank you, is the MLS commissioner. He'll change the rules before July 24th. That I think maybe is what I'm thinking is the most likely to happen. Wookie says, what I don't get is how his permit will be ready in time for Leagues Cup when it took forever for other players. That's what happens when you have pull. I do know that the South Florida USCIS immigration offices have been a little bit more swamped than most of the country. So sometimes it's easier for other clubs to get through quickly. But back in January, February, I think it was a specifically tough time to get paperwork pushed through. RJ says a 6-month loan and then must buy next transfer window type contract. That's sort of what I was suggesting. Giovanni says, let's see what CB they are working on and maybe a natural winger. We'll talk about what comes next at the end of this. Marina says, that's unbelievable. Rodri is an amazing athlete and player. I can't believe he's coming over. So happy for the Fab Four and Messi in particular. Eden says, can't Busquets sign a new contract now, but as a TAM player instead of a DP? This is the same thing with the Jordi Alba situation where whether he signs a new contract or not, he's already being paid too much in 2025 to buy him down to a non-DP status. So no, he can't do that. Don Garber. Thank you, Russell. Nick Smith says, peace out, Redondo. We will talk about Redondo and some of the other players on the roster that this will affect. AJ says, the better question is how DePaul's arrival affects the rest of the midfield. Lots of midfielders. We will talk about that. Kramaski, Yannick Bright, other guys. And then AJ says, if you sell Redondo, you can bring in a $12 million U22 winger or striker. We will talk about all of that as we get into some of the next steps on this. But let's talk about how Rodrigo de Paul fits in, because he's 31 and this is a huge signing. We're talking about one of the 4 or 5 biggest, most expensive signings in the history of the league. Box-to-box midfielder. Here's a fun fact. I believe this is true. He just turned 31 in May. So really, like last year, he was age 30. This upcoming 12 months will be his age 31 season. This 4-year contract will expire, and he'll still be younger than the ages Busquets, Alba, and Messi were when they signed with Inter Miami. So when you think about adding experienced veterans and guys who are on their last legs in Europe and guys who have done it all and are ready to sort of get to their retirement level, I do think Busquets and Alba and Messi were in that age group and fit that sort of category when they signed. And obviously they have the competitive spirit to still be good, but certainly at 36, 37 years old, you can see how they would fit that definition by a lot of people's understanding. This player doesn't. This player's 4-year contract will expire before he's that age in 2029. He just turned 31 years old in May. So this is an in his prime player who starts for one of the best teams in the world. That's an immense talent. And as a player, he's a box-to-box midfielder, tenacious defender, really can do it all, though. Last season, he had 13 goal contributions and 53 appearances. So is a two-way player. And as a box-to-box, to play at that level, you really have to be able to do it all. uh, because there's so many players that can do some things, but to get to that level, you have to be an all around player. Now, listen, I'm not a huge Atletico Madrid, and I'm also not a huge Argentina guy. So I'm sure many of you have seen this player and know him in much better depth than I will. So I won't try to explain who he is as a player, other than to say box to box skill set, tenacious defender, has some goals in him, can go both ways. And for Atletico Madrid, he was a key part of that midfield. So and for Argentina, he's also a big part of the midfield. One of the things, not in my notes, but I guess I should mention, he's been considered sort of the bodyguard of Messi, is a starter for the Argentine national team. And so for Inter Miami to have that sort of bodyguard on the field, I don't know if it's necessary, but it's certainly something to keep in mind. And again, this is a guy that has a lot of chemistry with Lionel Messi. Uh, okay, so how does he fit in? Inter Miami has been playing this 4-4-2 over the last couple months, where you have your back four in a traditional, relatively conservative positioning, and then you have four across out of possession with Messi and Suarez up top as that front two, and that midfield pivot, the two midfielders in the middle, have played very conservatively. Busquets and whether it's Yannick Bright, whether it's Benjamin Kramaski, whether it's Federico Redondo, they have sort of rotated. Before Yannick Bright got injured, it was mostly Bright and Redondo. In recent weeks, it's been Kramaski and Redondo because Yannick Bright pulled his hamstring. Uh, that's, I think, the most logical position for Rodrigo de Paul. And if you just sort of put him in the lineup, it's most similar to what he's done for Argentina. It's most similar to what he's done for Atletico Madrid. And so I think when he debuts, it's going to be next to Busquets, assuming Busquets is still on the team. In that box to box, more of a defensive role with the ability to play it forward and to make runs, progressive carries, which is one of his, I think, best going forward attributes. Next to Busquets. And that's the role Yannick Bright, Kramaski, and Redondo have played. So um, we'll see what happens to them. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But for Inter Miami, I expect that to be the first lineup we see with De Paul in it. Tadeo Allende out on the right wing as a guy who sits back in that 4-4-2 out of possession, but then in possession makes the runs. In behind it, tries to play as more of a wide forward. And then for Velasco Segovia on the left to be that sort of deep lying connector role that we've seen from him over recent months that he's really excelled in. So that's my expectation. If you've watched the show, you know I'm not a big fan of this setup. I'm not a big fan of this style. Messi and Suarez is that front two, certainly limits your capacity to play higher up the field. There's a reason we never saw that, or at least we didn't see it frequently with Tata Martino in the first year that Messi and Suarez were in Miami. But it's something that they've stuck with pretty consistently over the last this whole season, really. So I wouldn't expect that to change. And if that's the case, we're looking at 2 or 3 roles that Rodrigo de Paul could even play because he's not here to be the striker. And if Busquets stays, then Busquets is going to play. So you're looking at that box-to-box double pivot role that currently is occupied by Yannick Bright or Redondo. You're talking about taking over the Tadeo Allende role where he can get forward and be an offensive threat and make runs in behind. And then you're talking about Velasco Segovia as a guy who has been responsible defensively for helping Jordi Alba, but also has been much more of a connector. My personal opinion is that we will find Rodrigo de Paul fits better on the wide midfield roles in terms of his setup within the team. It wouldn't shock me if we end up seeing Rodrigo de Paul play as a right midfielder instead of Tadeo Allende. We get Segovia on the left, and we get Busquets and Yannick Bright, or Busquets and Kramaski, or Busquets and Redondo in the midfield. That wouldn't shock me. The other thing we have to consider is, will we change our formation and play style? Now, the thing about Rodrigo de Paul, incredible talent. Certainly he's going to be potentially the second best player on the team behind Messi from the first minute. So when you're talking about guys like Kermaski and Yannick Bright and Allende and Federico Redondo, he's certainly a much higher level talent, but it's not necessarily a position Inter Miami's been weak in, if that makes sense. Yannick Bright, by MLS standards, is an excellent player. So certainly DePaul's a better player, but I don't know if he fundamentally changes what you can do within the same system. It's not like if you changed Suarez in for an ultra athletic, high pressing center forward, that would, even within the same sort of formation and structure, would allow you to do much different things. I'm not sure Rodrigo de Paul is going to be transformative in that way, at least not if he plays in that double pivot next to Busquets. So, what does that mean for how Inter Miami is going to play? Listen, we saw much more of a 4-2-3-1 early in the season with um, Redondo. I'm sorry, not Redondo. Segovia playing much higher up the pitch and having sort of two wide forwards connecting. That's not something they've gone to in quite some time. They've really gotten comfortable with this 4-4-2. So, will Javier Mascherano change from this setup? What I want to say, I don't think Javier Mascherano has been particularly involved in this transfer. What do I mean by that? Of course, he's been told about it, kept informed. I'm sure he's thinking about how to use DePaul. But it's not like Javier Mascherano went to the ownership and was like, I need Rodrigo de Paul. Get me this player because he's the midfielder that's going to unlock everything. This is certainly much more led by the ownership and the Messi group trying to get high quality players that he can convince to come, but also from the ownership's perspective, get players that are going to make Lionel Messi want to stay long term. We'll talk about what this means for Messi in a few minutes. But um, what I mean by all of this is ownership, Messi, they went out and they said, Rodrigo de Paul's a good friend. He's a player I have good chemistry with. He's young and we can convince him to come now. Let's go make it happen. It's not Javier Mascherano looking at his team and playing on his whiteboard and saying, man, if only I had Rodrigo de Paul. Hey, can we get this guy? That's not it. I would be shocked if that's how it went. I think this is clearly a front office, top down type of transfer. So for Javier Mascherano, he's going to be given this player, and he's an immense talent. I don't mean to make it sound like a bad thing, but he's going to have to figure out how to use him, not that he already knows how to use him and he's just waiting to get the perfect piece. Certainly, that's not what this is all about. So, are we going to see Javier Mascherano experiment now that he has this new player in his lineup? This 4-4-2 system, if you put Tadeo Allende, I'm sorry, if you replace Rodrigo de Paul with uh, Yannick Bright, like you put de Paul in that role or Redondo or Kermaski, you're now putting those three young promising players on the bench. And as we've seen with guys like Suarez, guys like Busquets, Alba, Messi, Javier Mascherano doesn't like to rotate very much. So you're talking about those guys being on the bench a ton for the rest of this season and potentially for the rest of their time at Inter Miami. And I think that will have big implications. So, what do you do with the starting 11? It would not shock me if we see some other formations. Maybe we do go to a 4-3-3 and Messi moves out to that right wing position. And we can talk about how this team can make their best 10, 11, 12 players fit consistently instead of having to sit two or three of your best 11 because the pieces don't all fit together. That wouldn't surprise me either. I guess my point in suggesting all of this is just because we bring in this player doesn't mean we're going to play the same system. And if we're going to look at changing the play style, changing the formation, changing the roles of the players on the field, I think you can get ultra creative that it would just be speculating at this point. I also think, and I just want to be clear about this, this will get us into our next conversation. Um, Inter Miami, I think now has four midfielders above the fray. Fray, probably the ironic word to use here. But I do think Segovia, Yannick Bright, Rodrigo de Paul, and Sergio Busquets are in another tier compared to what we've seen from Redondo, Kramaski, etc. Excuse me one second. And we'll get to that in a second, but I want to get back to the chat. Um, some talk about Aviles. Eden Durant says, Bright Lujan and Ruiz traveled with the team today. Yeah, there's a game tonight, by the way, and we'll be doing the pregame show 1 hour before kickoff. It's my memo says, what if Miami transfers some players for GAM and uses that to have a larger TAM bucket? Alba gets paid $6 million, but would he be paid by TAM? Yeah, it doesn't work like that. You can only buy players down $1 million worth of allocation money. It's not possible to buy them down anymore. So basically, the DP level contract is, let's round up to $800,000. Any player making more than $800,000 has to be a DP, or they have to be bought down under $800,000 as a salary plus transfer fee amortized. So Rodrigo de Paul, even if he said, I'll take an $800,000 contract, or if he said I'd play for free, his $15 million transfer fee will be amortized over the next 4 years, which means that at minimum, he'll be at 3.5, 3.75 million before even his salary. So there's no way to make him a DP. Sorry, I didn't finish that thought. You can only buy a player down 1 million in allocation money. So if a player makes 800,000, you can, I'm sorry, if a player makes 1.8 million, you can pay 1 million to bring them under the DP threshold. But if a player makes more than 1.8 million, both salary and transfer fee, there's nothing you can do in terms of making them anything but a DP. So there's no way to go trade for more allocation money or anything like that. Vice City says, good evening, Scotty. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the subject, Lucas. Kay says, do you watch any football outside Inter Miami? I've heard you say you haven't watched Messi much before he joined. Yeah, I generally watch the Premier League and the U.S. men's national team. So CONCACAF soccer and the Premier League are like where I feel the most comfortable talking about. RJ says Yasin Shueko's job will be in jeopardy. That's the bodyguard for Inter Miami. RJ says that Baltasar guy is made out of glass. We can talk about that later tonight. Russell says Segovia, Busquets, Brighton, De Paul. I wouldn't be surprised if come the playoffs, this is the 4 across that we are playing with. Justin says it's going to be a loan. Wookie says finally a great signing, unlike Mascherano's disappointing picks. And then mentions Lujan, Baltasar, Obando. Gabriela says, I hope not. We need our young midfielders playing. Speaking of, Wookie's comment, again, I don't think this is a Mascherano-led thing. So how Mascherano reacts to this in terms of who he puts out there and exactly how, I think will be very interesting and telling about him as a coach. Okay, so let's talk about the long-term ramifications of this transfer because, let's be honest, I think that's the most interesting. First off, and this is the biggest news, not something we've been surprised about on this show, and it's always been rumored to be the case, but Lionel Messi is going to sign a new contract. It will be through the end of 2026. I would expect it to have an option, a player option for 2027 so that he can just trigger it if he decides he wants to keep playing. But basically, Inter Miami and Lionel Messi are going to come to terms on an agreement that will keep him here until 2027 unless he decides he wants to retire early. So I think that player option will be there, but he's going to spend the next 2 years at Inter Miami, 2.5 years at Inter Miami in all likelihood. And I think the only thing that would prevent that is if he decides I won the World Cup next summer. I want to go out like this or something crazy like that. But I think we're getting Lionel Messi for the next 2.5 years. And I think that's great news for Inter Miami fans and everyone involved in the MLS. We did a giant season preview with a lot of Inter Miami journalists and Inter Miami fans and podcasters and all that stuff at the beginning of the season. We did sort of a rapid fire question and we asked them, do you think Inter Miami will make the Big Four, Big Five this summer? And we mentioned guys like Di Maria and Neymar as potential options, but, just are they going to add another big name? And I want to give Franco Panizzo credit because his answer was yes, and a lot of the answers were yes, but the reasoning really stuck with me. And that's because Inter Miami needs to show Lionel Messi that they're serious about continuing this project and being successful at the top level for the next couple years so that Messi still has a competitive team and they want to show him they're serious about that. And that always stuck with me because well, A, it makes a ton of sense. Inter Miami needs to get Lionel Messi to re-sign that new contract. Bringing in a player like this, I think, is an incredible way to show not only are we going to bring you your friend, but another Argentine that you have a great relationship with, but also a player that's going to help this team be ultra competitive. And we're not going to let any roster rule or perception that this is a retirement league. We're not going to let any of that stand in our way from getting this player. And so, again, I started this podcast by giving the front office a lot of credit, but I think they had to do this to show Lionel Messi we are absolutely serious about building a competitive team over the next 2.5 years, so that for the rest of your career, you're not just going to be in the MLS, but you're going to be competing to win the MLS. And I don't know if it was looking like that 3 weeks ago when the roster, the MLSPA released their financial report, how much each player was being paid. There was a lot of what's the right word? There was a lot of disappointing numbers in there. I'll put it that way. The amount of money they were paying Chelo Wigan, the amount of money they were paying Oscar Scotty, guys like that. It just showed they didn't have a ton of flexibility, and they were set in with some high wages on guys that maybe aren't performing up to that wage level. And so, and Gonzalo Lujan and some of the other guys, and there were some good numbers too, but it just felt like, man, you're getting caught in this Ustadi thing. And while Ustadi's been good, you want to keep flexibility to upgrade at goalkeeper, because it's not like he's been the best goalkeeper in the league. You want to make sure that you can keep some of your young talent that have given you incredible depth. So you're going to need to spend more money on a new contract for guys like Yannick Bright and Noah Allen soon. Um, and then if you have all this money tied up on guys like Cello and Lujan, et cetera, it's going to be a problem moving forward because you don't have the flexibility. And so if their plan was, we're going to take Ustadi and Cello and Busquets and Jordi Alba and Messi and Suarez into the next 2 years, and we're going to try and compete, I think we've seen this year that that's not a winning formula on a consistent basis. Now, I know Messi's been incredible, but it just felt like these guys are getting older. These guys are being paid a lot of money. I don't know if this was the recipe for a successful 2026 and 2027, to just run everything back as is. And then we got the Rodrigo de Paul news. And that, I think, resets everything, because it shows the club also knows they need to reset. Is Jordi Alba going to be on the team next year? Yes, but it's not going to be as a DP. Is Sergio Busquets going to be on the roster next year? Maybe, but it's not going to be as a DP. So they're going to open up some spots for those big name players. They're replacing, I think, effectively long-term Federico Redondo on this roster with Rodrigo de Paul, or they're giving Federico Redondo the keys if Busquets doesn't return either this summer or next year, to play that position consistently, and then he'll earn his move out of this league, and then you'll be able to replace him with the new U22 spot. We've heard about Talasco Segovia drawing interest from clubs, so you'll be able to use that U22 spot. And I think more importantly than all of that, if you have the ambition to go get a Rodrigo de Paul, you would think your ambitions for a new U22 would be at a much higher level. And I do think we're going to get to those conversations over the next few months, whether it's this summer or in December, January, which means all of a sudden that top end of your roster could really look a lot different. If you added DePaul and you add maybe another DP, maybe it's a striker, maybe you get a U22 winger that's incredibly athletic, and another U22 center back or something like that, a right back that has a huge potential. The kind of guy that, Chelo Wigan, he's 24, 25. He is what he is. And I think he's been very serviceable this year, but he doesn't have that elite upside. If you can go get the next Talasco Segovia at right back, where you're getting all those crosses whipped in, or center back, where it's a guy who is going to turn into a $20 million, well, at center back, maybe you're looking at a $10, $12 million player going to La Liga or whatever. Like, that could be a hugely impactful piece for Inter Miami to go sign. And so I think for me, it's the renewed high level of ambition makes me excited about what they could do with the U22 spot, or with that second or that third DP spot next year if Busquets and Alba and Suarez are non-DPs. right? If you're looking at Messi, De Paul, and a blank spot for that third DP, what would that look like? Maybe we're getting a fourth DP this summer, and that's the rule change. So if you're telling me those types of spots in the roster are going to become available, if you told me that a month ago, I would have been excited, but nervous. The fact that they went out and got Rodrigo de Paul makes me feel much better about their ability to go find great players and convince them to come to Inter Miami. And so I think that's a really nice thing. And then the other thing I want to mention, when Inter Miami signed Lionel Messi, took the league by storm, obviously won the League's Cup in his first 7 games. Going into 2024, they had built the best roster in the MLS, the deepest roster in the MLS. It was, for all intents and purposes, the type of roster that no team had ever seen in MLS before. And so I think that was great. And I thought maybe they're a little worse than they were last year in 2025, but they're still on paper the most talented roster. But the thing about the MLS that a lot of people don't necessarily quite perceive is it gets better every single year. And so Inter Miami at the top, even if they're at the top, the gap's going to shrink every single year. And so if you want to keep that gap, keep yourself as the best team in the league and keep it by a significant margin as the best team in the league, you have to continue to sign new players that are better and better and better. And so a guy like Redondo, a guy like Toto Aviles, they may have been really good U22 signings 2 years ago, but the league has gotten better now. And so if you want to get the most out of that U22 spot, you're looking at having to go get the Thiago Almadas of the world, the type of guys that are going to go be $40 million players in 3 years. If you want to maximize what your U22 spots can be. So it's going to be hard, but I think the fact that they were able to get this Rodrigo de Paul deal over the line, I think makes me feel a lot better about their ability to get a great signing from here. Okay, RJ says, now that Martinez is gone, we have a big problem in our defense. All we have is Lujan, who can't defend. Avilos with the hot head, and Allen is injured. We can't play Busi and Falcone as our starting center backs. I'm going to get to that next. Francisco says, Bright will want to leave next season. Lowest paid player in the roster, and they bring in a player that will most likely bench him. We're going to talk about this, but I think they need to give Yannick Bright a new contract or sell him to a big club. I think he's earned that. I don't know. As a defensive midfielder, I don't know if you can stand out enough at the MLS level, but if anyone has, it's certainly him. So I think he needs to get a new contract this winter by the start of next season, or we're looking at moving him for $7 million to a mid-table club in Italy or something to that nature, or we get a big sell-on clause. Mistiano says Scotty doesn't have school or work. I am fortunate enough to be able to work from home with a very flexible schedule in terms of when I have to get my stuff done. So it allows me to go live when we have breaking news like this. Justin says DePaul needs to play in the middle. It's interesting. And I think that's why we might see a different formation, because we're very low on wingers. We're very low on wide players. And that is by design. It is how Javier Mascherano built this team. But you also have to get the most out of your best players. Jake says Busi and DePaul in the middle will be good. He's got a motor. Yeah, again, I don't think there's... Listen, Rodrigo de Paul, I'll continue to say this, is a better player by leaps and bounds compared to a Kramaski or Yannick Bright. But those guys didn't lack a motor. And so I think replacing one for one isn't going to dramatically change how this team operates. I think the coaching staff has to figure out a way to make this team operate in a different way. And so I think to get the best out of this move, I think you're going to have to switch formations to something that allows your central midfielders to play well as central midfielders. And I don't think this 4-4-2 is necessarily that. Mistiano says we need pace, enough turtles. Barcelona 4 not going to get any faster or better. Need to offset the grandpas. Taran says first thing IMCF needs to address is the right back position and a striker. We'll come back to that. Rosso says you could argue that Miami doesn't have any true wingers. We'll come back to that. Busi, DePaul, Bright, midfield. Yeah, and I think you're looking at a midfield where if you put Busquets, DePaul, and Bright in, you're talking about a very defensive formation for certain games. And if you swap out Bright for Segovia, you're talking about an incredibly attacking and dangerous midfield for certain games. And if those are the 4 midfielders that are playing virtually every game in the starting 11, Like, you have tools for whatever you need for that specific game. Like, you can get really excited about it. Um, and so I think that's really, really fun to play around with moving forward. Mitch says, is a Bright to Ball DM pairing too defensive when Boosie is not playing? I don't think so. I think you put Bright, DePaul, and Segovia. You're talking about a much more athletic and talented midfield. Certainly doesn't have the ball passing ability that a Busquets has, but I think DePaul will be a ball carrier from the midfield in a way that we are not used to from any of our midfielders. So I think you'll get a lot from that. And I think defensively you upgrade and it allows you to get higher with your fullbacks and stuff. So again, when you start playing around with it, there's a lot of fun and interesting things, but it's just a matter of can Javier Mascherano put them in positions to succeed. Again, I don't necessarily think a 4-4-2 is the right formation for this team. And so what could be and what will be, I think hopefully there's not much gap and we're not stuck dreaming about what should be. Missiano says 100% have no true wingers. Allende can't dribble or win 1v1. Yeah, listen, here's the deal. If Inter Miami, let me rephrase that. If Javier Mascherano wanted true wingers on this roster, there would be true wingers on this roster. He would have kept Robert Taylor. He would have kept Julian Gressel. He would have played Fafa Picault more. They would have gone out and signed some wingers. I know a lot of people are saying this as if we need to go sign wingers, but I think Javier Mascherano showed us in the first half of his first season that he doesn't want to play with true wingers. We would see Messi playing out on that right side as opposed to as that sort of second striker, number 10 type that he's in now. And so I don't think putting another winger on the roster changes much unless Javier Mascherano has a change in his philosophy. And so you're right. There aren't really great wingers on the roster, but how do you make that happen? How do you work around that? Because it's not necessarily a roster construction thing. I think it's a coaching thing where he doesn't want to play with true wingers. And if he did, the roster wouldn't look like it does now. Taran says my midfield is Rodrigo, De Paul, Busquets, and Bright. Yeah. And again, if you want to battle it out in the midfield and you want it to be ultra aggressive, take out Busquets, put in Kremaski. You have three battlers in the midfield. If you want it to be more offensive, you can take out Yannick Bright and put in Telasco Segovia. Now it's an incredibly attacking, talented midfield. And if you want to be more defensive, you go with this. You go to Paul, Busquets, and Yannick Bright. And now you're talking about very difficult to break down. The midfield could be really fun. And I think it would be a shame if we left it in sort of this double pivot situation. Francisco says De Paul will be the second best player in the MLS. From a technical and quality point of view, he won't be a scorer, a great assister, but he will be the best after Messi. Maybe. I'm trying to think of who might be better. And I don't necessarily have a name that's coming to mind that I think is definitely a better player than Rodrigo de Paul. So I think that's certainly something that we might be saying at the end of this season. Vaishnav says, do you think we could have gone for a better U22 player than Segovia? I want to say something about Segovia. I think we can buy him out of U22 status. So if you're looking for roster flexibility somewhere this summer, that might be one. He's only making about $330,000, and his transfer fee was $2.5 million. So if you amortize that, you're talking about a player making about $1 million a year with the transfer fee on the books. You can buy that out of U22 status if you wanted to. So actually, for the first time, I think we might actually there's a U22 spot there to be had if you wanted to go for it. Missiano says DePaul's actually pretty progressive compared to other options. Yeah, and you think about, I mentioned this earlier. If you're going to be a box-to-box midfielder on one of the best teams in the world, you're going to be an incredible talent offensively and defensively at this level. He's going to be a star, no doubt about it. Marco says not a good passer. You haven't watched one game he has played in. Did not say he wasn't a good passer. I think his best skill set is as in terms of compared to what we've seen is as a progressive carrier. As I've said multiple times, if you're going to play at that level, you have to be great at everything. Josue says, how mad will the other teams in the league be about this signing? I think the most interesting part of this whole transfer, after you add this talent, And at least in the time between him signing and him actually playing his first game, because once he's on the field, that'll be the cool part about it. But in the meantime, it's how does this make sense? I speculated earlier on what it could be, but um, certainly I think there's going to be a lot of upset fans across the league, unless this is some sort of roster rule change that benefits them as well. Sammy says I like the idea of a 5-3-2 with Busquets in the back, giving the younger mids a chance to dominate that area of the pitch. Very interesting idea, Sammy. Very interesting idea. Missiano says sack Mascherano then. Preaching to the choir, my friend. Rossell says hopefully they can bring Brian Rodriguez in. Yeah, or a winger of that ilk. But again, we're talking about having to change the entire setup of this team. Jake says they can sell Drake. I don't really know if that makes much of a difference. JoJo's World says we need a striker. I'm going to talk about what Inter Miami goes from here in a second, but I do not expect them to sign a striker as long as Luis Suarez is in this roster. And by the way, I don't think it would make much of a difference. If I told you Inter Miami can go out and sign one of the most promising young strikers in South America and bring him into this roster, that I think would get a lot of people excited. And then I would say, yeah, that's Alan Obando. They already brought in one of the most promising young strikers in South America, and he never plays. And that's a coaching decision. It's a Luis Suarez decision. But I guess what we can learn from that is as long as Luis Suarez is on this team, no other striker is going to get heavy minutes. Hernan says, I think De Paul should become captain as soon as possible. He likes to talk a lot. Otherwise, he'll get so many yellow cards. One of the things we didn't mention, and I think this is interesting, is Rodrigo de Paul signing a 4-year contract that will outlast Messi, in all likelihood. I expect Messi to retire. I expect Messi to leave Inter Miami and probably retire at the end of 2027. And De Paul will be here until the summer of 2029. So De Paul will be, I think, the face of this team at some point in the future. And I think Inter Miami should be prepared for that. And it's not something I've thought a ton about, but would not surprise me if he's the captain the minute Lionel Messi retires. Mistiano says rather sell Segovia and keep Bright if it's one or the other. I think they will sell Segovia at some point soon, probably in January if I had to guess, maybe next summer. And I don't know what the timeline is for Yannick Bright, but I do think he needs a new contract because he's too important to this team to be the second lowest paid player on the team. Mitch says, I don't think Segovia is a U22, but if he is, and you can indeed buy down Segovia as a U22, and that means we would need a U22 signing in order to keep that 3 U22, 3 DP designation. Well, you can just leave the spot open, but yeah, I think as of right now, he's categorized as a U22, but I do think he can be bought down. Liberty says winning MLS Cup is essential now. Winning MLS Cup was always essential. I want to make that very clear. Mitch says, I think ultimately Redondo gets sold to free up the U22 spot. Okay, let me get to the last thing I wanted to talk about, which means what comes next for this team in this transfer window. As some of you may have heard today, David Martinez's loan expired today. So he's officially off the roster, went back to River Plate. I do not know what his future holds. Maybe in an episode soon, we'll wax lyrical about him because I think he was a good piece. And I don't want to not do him justice by just glossing over the fact that he's left the team. But this is a Rodrigo de Paul conversation and a transfer window conversation. So I'll save that for another time. So that frees up a center back spot. It frees up a nice, healthy wage spot on the roster for Inter Miami. And they don't pay the transfer fee. I think this means they have to go get another center back. And while David Martinez, I thought was a nice player, he only played 21 games over the course of the last year for Inter Miami, was injury prone. So I don't think you would expect it to get any easier. And then buying the transfer fee would have been a pain as well. So it makes sense that they don't re-sign him, even though he was a nice player while he was here. I think the other thing that makes this make sense, And the reason we've been expecting this move since January or December even is because Javier Mascherano is going to want his guy. Back in January, we said it like it was a good thing. I don't know if it's necessarily a good thing now, but I still think it rings true. He went out and brought Gonzalo Lujan and Maxi Falcone in. I don't know if those have been exceptionally good transfers. Maxi Falcone's certainly better, but he's had his inconsistencies. Was benched for a while by Mascherano. Lujan, I'll just say I'm not a huge fan of Lujan and leave it at that. Um, and obviously, the rising of Noah Allen has, I think, been a huge boon to this team. Ian Frey, I think, showed for the first time this season and under Javier Mascherano in the Club World Cup that he can play at center back. And then you've got Toto Aviles. I think they're going to want to bring in another center back. They have the international roster slot freed up from David Martinez. They have a couple, by the way, international roster slots that they got at the end of the winter window. So the Rodrigo de Paul thing won't be a problem. I think they're going to bring in another center back. Is he going to be good? I hope so. Is it going to be Javier Mascherano's choice, or is it going to be Lionel Messi's choice, or is it going to be Alberto Diaz, the new sporting director's choice, or is it going to be Jorge Mas going out and getting the biggest name he can figure out how to make happen? I don't know, but I think they're going to add another center back, and I think we should expect him to be maybe the number one guy based on the salary being vacated by David Martinez, who was the highest paid center back on the roster. So I think that should be an expectation. We saw them flirting with a couple forwards earlier in the summer when we had that basic transfer window during the Club World Cup, pre-Club World Cup window. They flirted with Brian Rodriguez. Apparently they wanted two forwards at that time, but when you think about it, I'm not sure if it makes a ton of sense unless Javier Mascherano has real plans to change how this team plays. Brian Rodriguez was a name that was mentioned a lot. Who knows what's going to happen with there? But I guess my point is it wouldn't shock me, but I'm not sure how much sense it makes to bring in a winger, considering we don't really play with wingers. You don't really need another midfielder. You're loaded with midfielders. At left back, Jordi Alba is going to play almost every game, and Noah Allen can certainly cover for him. At right back, Chelo Wiegand, based on the salary they're paying him this season, he's going to play a ton. And then it's just a matter of if Ian Frey can play better and convince the coach to play him more at right back. At goalkeeper, they've already signed Ustadi for another year. So I think you're stuck with Ustadi. At goal, you might see Drake leave the team, but I don't think you're going to see a new goalkeeper. And I don't think they're going to sign another striker because they already brought in one of the most promising strikers in South America in Alan Obando. So, and he doesn't play. So, and I've said this many times, but I think for anyone wondering about Obando, I think it has more to do with Suarez not wanting to come off than it does with Obando not being good enough. And so if you already got a player that's competent at this level and probably needs and deserves more minutes, he's not getting them because Suarez is not interested in not playing. And a coach that's not strong or willing to tell Suarez that he needs to sit sometimes, then it doesn't matter if they bring in another striker because Suarez is going to continue to play. So I think you're looking at a center back this window, and if you have some pieces leave, you might bring in some replacements. I think, and I've always said this, I would love it if they could bring in a true number 10, a Thiago Almada type. I don't know if there's someone in South America that would fit that mold, but if they freed up that U22 spot to go get a guy like that, I think would be really interesting. Of course, you'd have to have Messi move back out to that right wing to make it work, but even that, I don't know if it makes as much sense now that you have Rodrigo de Paul in the fold. So center back, I think, is the next thing on the list. And then maybe a forward if they can figure out how to make it work. Sort of a winger would be my expectation. As far as outgoings, because incomings are not as diversely interesting as they usually are. They brought in De Paul, who's a box-to-box midfielder, and that feels like the one spot on the team where they had a ton of depth. We've mentioned Yannick Bright a lot on this podcast. We've mentioned Federico Redondo. We've mentioned Benjamin Kremaski. I will also add Baltasar Rodriguez. I'll also add David Ruiz. I'll also add Santi Morales as a younger player. They are loaded at depth in this midfield position, and so How exactly does Inter Miami handle that? And maybe there's an outgoing player that excuse me, we're not necessarily expecting. Redondo, maybe. I think it depends on how exactly Inter Miami makes this situation work with Rodrigo de Paul. Because if Busquets leaves the team, not that I'm expecting that necessarily, but as one possible solution, I think Redondo and Yannick Bright fit really nicely into that defensive midfielder role behind Rodrigo de Paul. If you're still going to have Busquets and Rodrigo de Paul, I think you're talking about that third midfielder being sort of a rotating slot between uh, Talasco Segovia and Yannick Bright. And I think that leaves both Kramaski. You have room for maybe one of Kramaski or Redondo to come off the bench, but maybe one of them is on their way out. Maybe Kramaski's about to get his big move to the Premier League or Germany or Spain. Maybe Redondo is about to get that move to River Plate that was tweeted about by one person. So um, I don't know. It's very interesting. It's something to keep in mind. I think if anyone expected a big name signing this summer, you probably would have expected a winger like a Neymar or like a uh, Di Maria or someone like that. I don't know if a box to box midfielder was necessarily on anyone's list, and so if that's the case, as it has become, and DePaul has become official now, I think it makes you wonder what the rest of this roster is going to shake out because, of course, the club is going to know things we don't. Okay, Taryn says, rather than striker, sign a center back and a right back position. That RB is too weak. I agree with you that Cello is serviceable, but not particularly exciting. But they're paying him too much money this year. So I don't think we're going to see a right back. I do think we're going to get a center back. Missiano says, right winger, right back, center back, goalkeeper. Vice City is Redondo's going to get sold. He won't fit in this lineup now. I think that's, where I was just going with that. Rohan says DePaul signs for 4. Messi will leave in 2 years. So will DePaul. The Saudi money for DePaul will hit. That's another interesting point, actually, because there probably is some resale value on DePaul, which is not something we've ever thought of for the Big Four. But I don't necessarily think that's going to happen. The way I think this is going to happen, and I know maybe a lot of Messi fans don't love this idea, but I think there's a very real chance that all 4 or 5 of these guys are living in Miami for the next decade. And so even though they're not on the roster anymore, they're still going to be around the club, right? Part owners, club legends, etc. And they're still going to be around. Um, I don't know if that's probable, but I think it's at least reasonably probable. So it's a reasonable thing that might happen when these guys have kids in schools and stuff like that. Jake says, I will not be surprised if they sell Bright for plenty of GAM. This would be one of the worst moves Inter Miami ever makes if they sell Bright in the league. He's been too good for them and has been too valuable for them, and his contract's so delightful that he deserves to be treated better than that, I think. And so if you're talking about Udinese or someone from the Serie A coming in and spending $5 million, sure, you might let him leave for a little bit less. But in terms of MLS teams, I don't think Inter Miami should ever let this player play for another one anytime soon. Android says, what do you think the chances are that Messi scores another 2 goals today? I will say Cincinnati is a very good team. I think they're the second most talented roster in the MLS. They have a couple injuries today, so it'll be interesting. But that's a tough place to play. But it's Lionel Messi, so of course it wouldn't surprise me. Missiano says stem cell treatment for Martinez and loan him again. This is something I thought was plausible earlier on in the season. Is you just work out a loan extension for Martinez from River Plate, because it doesn't appear he's in the plans for River Plate either. So you would think they would be willing to sort of work with you on this, but it is a big salary, and I think they want to replace him, and I think that's why they've decided to not try and make that happen. Taran says, I think Redondo will be sold. And let me be clear about this. If Redondo gets sold, is he going to get sold this summer? Is he going to get sold in the winter? You know what I mean? It's like, I agree that Redondo is probably not going to be on this team in the long term, but what exactly and what's the timing of that? Because if we're talking about nothing changing until December, well, then we'll have plenty of time to sort of reevaluate things. And maybe it's not great to speculate about. But if we're talking about things that are going to happen in the next few weeks, I think that's much more interesting. Okay, guys. I think I'm going to wrap it up there. An hour and 10 minutes. Man, I would have expected this to go for 35. But you guys had some wonderful, wonderful things to say in the chat. I appreciate you as always. And we'll be back tonight because there's a game against FC Cincinnati in about 5 hours, 5.5 hours. So we will be live for the pregame show. We hope you guys will join us. But until then, have a lovely night. We'll see you guys next time. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. Do us a favor and hit that like and subscribe button. Since our first viewer, sharing this with you all has been the very best part. So from the beginning until the end, thank you for being a part of this and have a wonderful day.